Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer lore. Today we are going to be looking at lizards, and the large kind of lizard in particular, that we know as dragons. Now, these giant fire-breathing, lightning-breathing, noxious gas-breathing, ice-breathing, etc., etc. lizards have been around since before the Old Ones visited the Old World, which is an interesting little tidbit considering end-time lore that again states that the Old Ones are the survivors of the world that got destroyed previously that created a new world, and the fact that they were already shit on the planet before they showed up seems to hint at the whole thing that maybe that wasn't actually the case, but, buddy, okay, fuck it. And the first question should be, what is a dragon? And that's a bit more of a complicated question than you might originally think, because they are extremely malleable creatures. They adapt incredibly well to their environment. Now, there are some doubts as to whether or not this is good old-fashioned evolution, that means that the next generation is adapted to the climate, or if the dragons themselves eventually adapt themselves to a new climate. There are some contradictory tales of that, but for the most part, they will slowly but surely evolve to fit the new environment over the course of a handful of generations. This is pretty goddamn quick, everything considered, but it is also in contrast to some accounts that state that the dragons actively change themselves to fit the environment. So, let's go over some of the various types, shall we? In general, they are split into colours, where there are white dragons, black, red, forest dragons, blue dragons, sea dragons, zombie dragons, and chaos dragons. Starting from the top, the white dragons are frosty snow dragons. Their breath is a freezing chill mist so cold that its victims are numbed and frozen, and are virtually guaranteed to die as their strength slowly saps from their bodies. They also tend to be relatively small by dragon standards, probably simply because, well, if it's living in a snowy wasteland, odds are there's not going to be all that much stuff to eat around there. Not that dragons really require a constant source of food, by the way, but we'll get to that later. And then there are the black dragons. These are usually connected to the Dark Elves and are the descendants of the original dragons that joined with the Dark Elves and were, together with them, expelled to the dark land of Naggaroth. They do not breathe fire at all. In fact, they breathe a noxious gas that will choke their victims quite rapidly, and are usually, as I said, slave creatures to a far greater degree than pretty much any other race of dragons. Now, you can't completely enslave a dragon just because it's a goddamn dragon, but that has not stopped the Dark Elves from trying, and at the very least achieving a relative high level of success. Though in most cases, it's not so much by taming as by magical subjugation. They essentially take over the creature's mind and subjugate it to their own. Some relatively dark stuff that, as you of course then arrive at the question, well, what about the original dragons? Did they actually want to serve the Dark Elves? Considering that dragons have an innate ability to sense the intentions, feelings, and hatreds of their riders, it seems a little bit unlikely, but then again, dragons can be absolutely ginormous assholes themselves, so it is not beyond the realms of imagining that a few of them decided that, you know what, I feel like being a giant ass today, and try and kill my former masters, because whoopee-doopee-doo, that's pretty much why. And then there's red dragons, also often known as fire dragons or gold dragons, and they breathe, surprise, surprise, flames. I know, it was a fair bit of a shocker, that one, and is the most normal, or common, I should perhaps say, variant of dragon. As such, one could probably hazard a guess that this is the original version of the dragons that have later split on into various subspecies to adapt to their environment. Then, perhaps the rarest of them all, the forest dragons. giant green things that breathe a corrosive gas. And the vast majority of them, if not all of them, live in the forest of Athaloran. There are rumours and half-confirmed reports that forest dragons, and even a small band of wood elves in fact, reside in the Drakwold forest, but this is less than canon, let's just say. But, well, it's a dragon. It can fly. It wouldn't be too much of a stretch to assume that one of them might have decided that, you know what, I'm sick of this forest, I'm going to move to another forest. So I wouldn't completely ignore the possibility of a migrating dragon or two. Then there's blue dragons, or sky dragon, that fires lightning because of reasons. Then again, considering it is a magical dragon, I guess I shouldn't be dragging too much of logic into this. I could see how it could breathe fire, I could see how it could breathe gas and noxious fumes, but lightning, I'm wondering how exactly you breathe lightning, but never mind. Before I regress, let's move swiftly on to the next type of dragon, the sea dragon. Now, again, the name here should be relatively obvious as to what this creature is. It is a dragon that lives in the sea. Now, there have been some arguments as to whether or not these are actually dragons, because, well, you have to wonder a bit. First of all, a dragon is not aquatic. It does not breathe underwater, it doesn't have gills or anything along these lines, and it does have a pretty goddamn solid lung capacity for obvious enough reasons, considering it is a giant beast capable of flying, so its stamina has to be relatively goddamn good. But still, to think that a species of dragon would decide, you know what, I like to be wet all the time, and head off into the water, and then over the generations be able to create children that also decide that, you know what, I want to be wet as well, and walk into the water. Also to the point where they no longer have wings. And you also have to question yourself, well, what about the original bunch of dragons? How the hell did they live in the sea with those giants' wings? They must have been a bit of an impediment in the water, one would think. And considering the seas of the Warhammer universe is filled to the brim with tooth and bad attitude, it seems a little bit odd that such a handicapped creature would even be able to survive long enough to evolve, but here we are. In general, these creatures are probably the arseholeiest of all of their kind, as they hold virtually no master. A few efforts have been made to enslave these sea dragons by the Dark Elf, for example, but again, that's more akin to mind control than advanced pet training. Then, of course, not technically a subspecies of dragon, but there are zombie dragons. Now, why are there zombie dragons, you might ask? There has to be a bit of a story around this. Dead dragons don't just wake up again and start murdering the local villagers, do they? No, they don't. They were resurrected by the great necromancer Nagash, although whether or not he could control them completely is up to some debate, as most of the current zombie dragons are essentially not sentient. They are controlled, pretty much, as an extension of the caster's body. For example, if a particularly powerful vampire managed to get himself a zombie dragon, the zombie dragon would not have any real mind of its own. It would simply move according to the instructions of its master. However, there have been some tales of zombie dragons with a rudimentary intelligence, so it can be a little bit hard to figure out exactly which one is true. Now, the natural question might also be, well, where the hell do you find dead dragons? Well, you see, the dragons were a rather stupid race and decided to gather all of their dead in one massive area that came to be known as the Plane of Bones. Now, the story behind this is that dragons, for some reason, are able to sense the fact that they are about to keel over and croak, and therefore they decide that, well, you know what, I'm about to die anyway, so let's undertake one long-ass flight over to the other side of the goddamn world so that I can die in a massive plane covered by the corpses of my comrades. I don't know about you, but when I'm old, I'm going to be staying away from graveyards, but hey, magical beings and all of that nonsense. And, of course, for someone who is capable of raising the dead, for example a necromancer, just throwing that out there, a giant plane covered entirely in the bones of incredibly powerful creatures would probably be the closest thing a Necrak ever came to a wet dream, and as such, it really was only a question of time before someone decided to try, you know what? I've resurrected humans, I've resurrected Skavens, I've even tried to make an undead ogre. How about we go for a dragon next time? And lucky, just so happens, there's a massive goddamn graveyard filled with dragon bones with nobody watching it in the middle of nowhere, so pack your bags, we're going pet shopping. But before I lose myself completely in contemplating the Necromancer's wet dream, let's move on to the final type of dragon, the Chaos Dragon. Now, this one has a little bit of a backstory because there's not just a race of Chaos Dragons, it is a mutated, one would probably say, or perhaps even possessed dragon that was turned into the first Chaos Dragon. This was Galrausch, ridden by the elf prince Lerfin. During the first Great War against Chaos, during the very first incursion of Chaos into the world in fact, he and the dragon Galrausch fought against the Chaos invasion, but after Lerfin was killed by a great demon of Tzeentch, Galrausch killed and ate parts of the demon. Now, eating a demon might seem all fancy-wancy as a vengeance thing, but it turned out to be a bit of a problem, as the Great Dragon suddenly had one of the worst cases of indigestion in the history of the universe that caused his long neck to split in two, giving it two heads, because, well, it's a Chaos Dragon. It has to look funky in some way. The newly formed Demon Dragon started attacking its former comrades, as demons are wont to do, and almost put the elf army to flight before one of the two heads started attacking the other. This was believed to be the noble spirit of Galrausch still residing within the monster, trying to stop its rampage. However, eventually the demon side did take full control, but at that point it was already so wounded from the attacks by Galrausch's old spirit and the concentrated efforts of the elf army that it had to retreat into the Chaos Wastes to heal, where it lay slumbering for generations. Exactly how this dragon, without having anyone to mate with, seeing as there was no other Chaos Dragons, managed to create an entire race of Chaos Dragons is somewhat interesting, but then again, it at this point was essentially a demon, so it can do pretty much whatever it wants to do. So now there's a race of Chaos Dragons. And Galrausch himself has been known to raid villages, settlements, and even burn down entire cities every now and then, primarily just for kicks, shits, and giggles, one would assume, and unlike another large angry dragon that burned down cities in that certain movie about a hairy-footed savage, this version of the dragon is not stupid enough to stand in front of a giant tower with a would-be huntsman on top of it that has crafted a living crossbow out of his soon-to-be dead son. Because, let's face it, if that thing has enough tension to throw that giant arrow that far, that fast, and it is going to be hitting the neck of that kid, oh yes, that child is not surviving that one. But, moving on to the dragons themselves, now that we've talked about the various types, it's probably time to look at the various classifications, one could probably say. Generally speaking, the dragons are divided into three classes. Now this is the elven term right here. The sun dragons, which are the youngest, moon dragons are the middling ones in age and size, and the star dragons, the oldest and most formidable of the dragons. Now, most of the races have their own designations, but the same basic three dividing lines exist. Generally speaking, the older a dragon is, the bigger the dragon is, and the smarter and more composed the dragon is. However, there is a bit of a backside, namely the fact that dragons like to sleep. They like to sleep a lot, often for centuries at a goddamn time, and the older a dragon gets, the longer it wishes to sleep, so the really powerful dragons can only be aroused to anger in the most dire of circumstances, and in most cases only by the elves. The Dark Elves arouse them to anger by mind-fucking them, which is a pretty goddamn effective way of pissing anybody off, and the High Elves have a somewhat more gentle way in treating the dragons that, well, you know, it's your home too, so you should probably defend it, being the general argument. There is also a bond created between a dragon and its rider. In most cases, a dragon will not accept anyone not worthy to be its rider and will simply throw them off and nom them, being a pretty goddamn quick way of ending that particular relationship. Of course, Dark Elf dragons have a slight problem with that, seeing that they are currently being mind-raped by whoever is riding them, which makes the whole throw-off and nom plan somewhat more complicated. And some other drakes, like for example Chaos Dragons, are also usually bound to the will of their master, rather than a partnership like the High Elves prefer to have with their dragons. And this whole partnership certainly suggests an intelligence, and the dragons are indeed highly intelligent creatures, though their intelligence often comes as a bit of a backside in many cases when it comes to the lesser races, as they consider the vast majority of the other races as little more than verminous insects that are running around shitting all over their previously owned lands and digging up their gold. As such, they generally take a rather dim view to the likes of humans, and particularly dwarves. Now, the dwarves have a tendency to be a somewhat threatening race, as they do not like dragons, and dragons do not like them. The dragons really do adore one part of the dwarves, though, the fact that they like to hoard large quantities of gold in very limited locations, and often, for by dragon standards at the very least, not that well guarded. Which, as you might imagine, have led the dragons to have a go or two at gold deposits, because for some magical reason, dragons like shiny things like that. They're essentially just giant crows, except, you know, they breathe fire and that kind of nonsense. What the hell a use a dragon has for gold anyway is beyond me, but hey, sure. And, as you might imagine, the dwarfs take somewhat of an umbrage to the whole thing about a dragon moving into their carracks and stealing all of their stuff, or, well, in most cases they don't steal all of their stuff, they just roast all the dwarves inside the fortress and then sit on the pile of treasure, because, well, easier. Additionally, as one might expect, dragons do have to eat. Now, during their extended periods of hibernation, I suppose we should say, their need for energy is decreased to such an incredible level that they can sleep for centuries, but when awake they do require a fair bit of nommies, which means that they're going to be pissing off the local farmers as they repeatedly eat entire herds of cows as an appetizer. Again, not exactly an ideal situation for the dear old Yumis or anyone else that wants to have beef anywhere close to the dragon. So when you add these minor hurdles to cohabitation to the simple fact that the dragon considers everything smaller than it to be Neanderthal troglodytes barely worth breathing fire on, you usually have a pretty damn hostile neighborhood relationship between dragons and any of the lesser species. This is not to say that all dragons are massive assholes that run around eating other people's foods and stealing their shiny trinkets, but a good deal of them are. The High Elf dragons are, well, they're arrogant pricks, but then again, so are the High Elves, so they're very much so kindred spirits in that respect, and the High Elves tend to feed their dragons, so they avoid the whole eating all of their shit thing, or at least partially avoid that particular problem. Now, there are also dragons that have taken a certain liking to the lesser races, not to the point of outright protecting them in most cases, but, you know, not eating them, for example, which for a dragon is considered to be pretty damn lenient. There is, for example, an imperial dragon. This is a dragon that lives in the zoo in Altdorf. Now, as you might imagine, if the dragon wanted to go outside, there's not a whole lot to stop it, and in fact, the keepers don't even bother attempting. The thing can pretty much leave more or less whenever it wants. However, why would it want to? It is surrounded by adoring crowds that call it kawaii and other horrible names, and pet its scaly bulk and, even better, they feed it and let it have all kinds of trinkets. As such, the dragon is pretty goddamn happy. So happy, in fact, that it usually allows emperors to ride it. Now, this is a little bit dependent on the emperor. It doesn't seem to have too much of a problem with letting dear old France have a go on his back, but it has attempted to eat one or two other ones that it considered to be, less worthy statesmen and more plump appetizer. However, the vast majority of dragons are not under high elf control tend to be a bit douchey to their locals, and, well, this is perfectly fine as long as the locals don't gang up in significant numbers, but that's the problem with the lesser races. They tend to have a rather severe numerical advantage, and as such the dragons were slowly but surely hunted down and exterminated. And, of course, this being a fantasy universe, there's always the lone shining bright hero that somehow manages to kill a dragon about 255 times its size with a tiny-ass sword because of, well, reasons and magic and la-da-da-da-da-da, it's fantasy, it doesn't have to make sense, la-da-da-da-da, stuff like that. So, currently there's not a whole lot of dragons left, and the vast majority of those that are still alive slumber deeply beneath the earth on the island of Ulthuan. As such, they are a pretty goddamn rare sight, and very, very few armies actually utilize them in their army. The High Elves and the Dark Elves are the only ones that really use them in any kind of quantity. The Dwarves, as I mentioned, are somewhat distrusting of the giant lizards. The Ogres consider them to be, well, snacks for the most part, whenever they can actually nom one. After all, killing a dragon will give a hell of a lot of food, which is always wonderful. The Empires only got to the one, and it's more along the lines of a you feed me, I will maybe let you ride my back relationship than a real, army relationship. And the undead zombie dragons, well, they're undead zombie dragons. They do utilize them in their armies to a fair extent, but it does require a pretty goddamn powerful sorcerer to actually bring one of those bastards to life. Well, that's the problem. You can animate it, but can you actually animate it for long enough to make it worth it, as you have to continuously pour magical energies into the thing to keep it moving and fighting, and, well, to put it simply, if keeping a single human soldier moving takes 1/100th of a halfway decent necromancer's power, then a zombie dragon is pretty much going to take all of that. And it might not be enough even then. As such, it is reserved only for the most powerful of undead commanders. And that has been my lore video on dragons in Warhammer. Now, this has been a very broad video, as you could certainly bring up examples of individual dragons with behavior patterns that might contrast with what I've said here, and that definitely does happen. There was, for example, the great dragon Indragnir during the War of Vengeance, who appeared to be a far more lenient and almost forgiving individual than you might expect from a dragon. He still took a fair bit of pleasure roasting dwarves inside their armor, but at least he wasn't quite as gung-ho aggressive as many of his fellow dragons. So, until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Have a good day.